Welcome to the Sirius report. This is Paul, and we're going to assess the fallout of the United States-Ukraine summit, meeting, call it whatever you like, in Riyadh. And frankly, the bottom line is it's a fiasco, it's meaningless, and we'll assess the reasons why. First, let's look at historically what's happened since Trump took office. He promised to end the war in a day. Then this timeline got pushed further and further out. Then there was claims of a month, 100 days, you name any number, and it was stated with confidence. And of course, what happened in the Oval Office recently, the utter fiasco when it descended into nearly a brawl between Zelensky, Trump, and of course Vance, and he was politely told to leave. And it looked as though the whole peace process, as far as the Ukrainian side were concerned, was in the toilet. It was over. There was no way they could come back from that. Well, of course, subsequently, there has been discussions to try and resurrect this discussion between the United States and Ukraine, hence this summit today in Riyadh, which, of course, tellingly, as we said previously, Zelensky was not in attendance, which was probably a very good idea. But let's be honest, they spent 7 hours or so talking. And when you look at the readout of what was actually discussed, it is an embarrassment and a joke. And you cannot possibly see how the Russians will remotely take this seriously. I would arguably say they're going to be furious about it. Because, of course, what was one of the first statements after Zelensky demonstrating his lack of gratitude for everything the West has done for him, notwithstanding, of course, the fact that none of it's been particularly of any benefit to Ukraine, but still enormous aid, enormous military hardware, etc., etc. And the US has been one of the biggest donors in that respect. So, of course, the delegation comes out and says, we have strong gratitude to Trump and Congress and the people of the US for making it possible to have meaningful progress towards peace. So they suddenly changed their mind in a few days from a long-held position. Absolutely not. They basically thought, well, our back's against the wall. We're going to have to turn up and make some of the right noises. And hopefully, on that basis, this will keep the United States happy, because the US has looked extremely weak. In some senses, they've also looked rather embarrassingly devoid of any diplomatic skills, because they came out with very sort of bombastic language about ending the war, and it's failed miserably. But Ukraine came out and then said today that they accept a US proposal to enact an immediate interim 30-day ceasefire, which can be extended by mutual agreement of the parties, and which is now apparently subject to acceptance and concurrent implementation, which of course it would have to be, by the Russian Federation. Now, Russia's position's been very clear the whole way through this entire conflict. There is no ceasefire. An agreement has to be reached, the war has to end, and that's the end. We're not having interim ceasefires because, as far as they're concerned, that's an opportunity for Ukraine to rearm and because if you look at the current state of the battlefield, particularly in the Pokrovsk, Donetsk region, Russia's on the verge of taking all of Donetsk. Pokrovsk is strategically very important, as we said previously, and they've basically now started to make inroads into the Dnipro region, which, of course, would be extremely damaging if Russia gets control of it from a Western perspective and a Ukrainian perspective. So it's in Ukraine's interest and the United States to say, well, let's have a ceasefire, an interim one. So what happens after 30 days? The war starts again. So what's the point? We're back to square one. In that time, both sides can accuse each other of rearming, which I think is more applicable from the Ukrainian perspective than the Russian perspective, who don't need to rearm. And the idea is that Russia's just going to accept this. Well, if they do, they've completely and utterly contradicted their stance all the way through any chance of any negotiations taking place. So the United States can go and communicate to Russia whenever it wants, which it doesn't seem to be in any hurry to do so. The a reciprocal approach from Russia is the key to achieving peace. Well, the argument is, yes, a ceasefire is a starting point, but not if it's just an interim ceasefire. And who's going to make assurances that neither side in that time moves forces, moves weapons, has weapons crossing the border into Ukraine, whether it's from Poland or Russia itself? Who's going to enforce this ceasefire? And if the ceasefire is broken, what does it mean? These are obvious statements. No one's thinking about it. The other thing is, on this spurious basis that something's been agreed, the United States says, well, we're now going to lift the pause on intelligence sharing and resume security assistance to Ukraine. Well, that's on a very flimsy pretext. The United States basically is rolling over and going, well, we've acted tough. Ukraine's kind of said they'll do something like have a ceasefire. Oh, so everything's okay now. So this is just the US walking away from the entire fiasco they caused by pretending they could end a war in the blink of an eye. They also apparently discussed about humanitarian relief efforts. Well, we can applaud that. In relation to the ceasefire, exchange of prisoners, any civilian detainees. I'm not sure where there was any, but okay. And then the return, they say, of Ukrainian children who ended up in Russia. That's a big thorny subject, but it's not relevant to this discussion. The other thing that's interesting is they're supposed to have reached this agreement and had a substantive 7-hour conversation. But apparently now, both delegations have agreed to name their negotiating teams and immediately begin negotiations towards an enduring peace that provides for Ukraine's long-term security. So what did they basically agree today? Nothing. They haven't even got a negotiating team. So they spent 7 hours effectively doing absolutely nothing. The United States has also committed to discussing specific proposals with the Russians. So basically the Russians are going to be told, despite the fact you're winning the war and you won the war, you're going to agree to some discussions that the Ukrainians, the US has had, with no concrete end product whatsoever, because after all, you haven't even got any negotiating teams. And by the way, you're both negotiating an outcome, and then you're going to tell us what that outcome is, and we have to agree to it. This, of course, is absolute nonsense. The other thing is the Ukrainian delegation said they want the Europeans to be involved in a peace process. Well, it's already been made crystal clear. From the Russian perspective, they are NATO countries, so you can't have NATO peacekeeping forces. So again, if that's an insistent sort of line item in any peace agreement, it's not going to happen. The agreement will never be enforced and Russia will just walk away, obviously. The other thing, of course, they were supposed to sign this mineral agreement, which was a precursor to a fund agreement for all these projects in Ukraine, and that got thrown out the window when there was the Oval Office debacle. They were supposed to sign it this time, and apparently they've now agreed to conclude as soon as possible an agreement for developing Ukraine's mineral resources, to expand Ukraine's economy, offset the cost of US assistance, whatever that might be, and apparently guarantee Ukraine's long-term prosperity and security. So they met up again where they're supposed to have had a deal that was about to be signed in the Oval Office, and now they're nowhere even near to signing anything. In fact, they haven't agreed on anything. So what exactly did they agree on that was supposed to be signed in the Oval Office? Again, it's just a fiasco. The US looks ridiculous, and frankly, it's an embarrassment. And really, you cannot imagine the Russians will take this seriously, which is a huge problem. So Rubio then comes out and talks about how the ball's in Russia's court and Ukraine has taken positive steps. What steps? There's no steps. They've just agreed to a ceasefire, which they want, which everybody knows Russia won't agree with. So why would Russia reciprocate that? I mean, and what are these concrete proposals? Proposals no one's prepared to discuss. So we had substantive talks on how the Ukraine war will end. Well, you might want to consult the Russians on that because I think they have a pretty big say how the war will end. And there doesn't seem to be any great urgency to talk to the Russians. And Rubio's going to go talk to the G7 ministers. Not exactly sure what he's going to tell them. Probably basically nothing. And also the discussed guarantees Ukraine will have for long-term security. Well, that probably is a discussion that ought to happen with the Russians as well. But again, are you just having some vague discussion to keep the Ukrainians happy, keep them on board so they don't storm away from a meeting again? And then really, there would then be no grounds whatsoever for any peace agreement. And that therefore means the war ends when Russia wins, and Ukraine on that basis would have to surrender unconditionally. So Rubio very crudely says the offer is to stop the shooting and we want Russia to say yes. Well, ordinarily, you're trying to back them into a corner, Russia, and go, well, if you don't agree to this, you're not serious about a peace agreement. But as I said earlier, try and enforce that in reality, and the whole thing falls apart rather rapidly. The other thing Rubio came out with and said, and it wasn't exactly clear what it related to, but there's no deadline. But we hope something will be done as soon as possible. I mean, what, 2 months, 6 months, a week, 4 months? No one knows. So overall, there were substantive talks with nothing agreed. There's no mineral deal in place. There's some promise of a 30-day interim ceasefire, whatever that means. Who's enforcing it? What are the terms and conditions of that? No agreements being made whatsoever. It's just words, because the US is so embarrassed that it was made to look so ridiculous in the Oval Office debacle. They then dragged them hastily back. They've got Zelensky out of the way and just said, look, agree to this. Then it looks like we're doing something. Then we'll talk later about this mineral deal. We'll talk later about forming teams to discuss detail. Substantive talks isn't a vague promise to form teams and then negotiate on things you apparently have already negotiated on, which of course is simply not the case. This is a farce. It's an embarrassment. It's a joke. It makes the United States look ludicrous. And at the end of the day, what Ukraine agreed to? Absolutely nothing. So what is the United States going to take to Russia and say to them? Well, we agreed on all these things. Oh, something happened. We can't really talk about it. Or we'll wait for some future negotiations. But by the way, just accept a ceasefire, because that's a good starting point. Now, we can't say exactly how Russia will respond to that, but I'd be amazed if they didn't just laugh at it and say, sorry, the war continues, come back with something of substance, something that's meaningful, and then we might be in a position to start negotiating. And with that, we end the podcast. Thank you very much for listening, for all your support, which we greatly appreciate. Please like, share, and subscribe. Helps to grow the channel, which we greatly appreciate. And of course, till next time we get together, I'll say goodbye.